Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Sport Vitamins for episode 49. Today's guest is Dr. Stephen Bird. Dr. Bird is a well known author, speaker, and researcher with expertise in elite athlete preparation, strength and conditioning, and nutritional supplementation. He has been an elite performance consultant and advisor to professional sports teams since 2000. Some of the topics that we covered with Dr. Bird are what is stress, how to monitor stress, and assessing sleep. So, without further ado, guys, here's episode 49 of Sport Vitamins with Dr. Stephen Bird.
Stephen, welcome on Sport Vitamins. How you doing?
Doing really well, thank you. Great to be here and look forward to having a discussion and sharing some knowledge.
Yeah, it's a great honor to have you on. I really appreciate you taking the time today and squeezing this call into your busy schedule. First of all, why don't we start with a little background?
Sure, certainly. Look, I've always been, as most of the listeners will know, that the people that you have on your show, I've been interested and involved in sport from various levels. I started at a young age in Australia playing rugby league, collision-based sport. Unlike our NFL counterparts in America, no padding or helmets, just beasts running into each other, similar to rugby, but a few less players on the field. So I played that as a young age, and that really captured my attention to training. And obviously, throughout, everyone has their idols that they follow as athletes, and a couple of particular players that I followed in the major leagues were just really engaged heavily in fitness. So that was sort of my mantra moving forward, trying to work on my fitness as I did. Went through the junior representative ranks to the point where I was able to try and get a contract to play in professional league in Sydney, in New South Wales. Had a couple of games there, became injured, and was unable to continue down that particular path. Was working predominantly in the gym environment at that stage, training a lot of athletes, and the opportunity arose to work with some boxing athletes with the Australian amateur boxing team before the Commonwealth Games in Kuala Lumpur in 1998. It was the first time Boxing Australia were taking a training staff with them, so I applied for the role, and unfortunately received the lovely "We regret to inform you" letter, and I was unsuccessful in my application because I didn't have a university degree. So that was the impetus then for me to explore and have an opportunity to go to university. So then I commenced in 1999 with an undergraduate degree in sport and exercise science and human movement. Was fortunate enough to receive a scholarship to do my honours degree in chronobiology, and then moved on to my PhD in exercise endocrinology and nutrition. And really, the educational component about the undergraduate degree and the postgraduate qualifications really allowed me to open up many doors then through professional sport. So, your learning never ceases. You're always learning, and I was fortunate enough at that stage to be able to go to university as a mature age student, and then really immerse myself in the learning at university, and that's been able to take me on to have some great opportunities in professional sport.
Interesting. Stephen, with you, I would like to start with a very, let's say, broad question. So I would like you to give to tell us something about stress. What is stress for you?
Sure. Yeah, look, stress is one of those interesting factors because it is really associated with both internal and external cues, right? So we can have stress from an internal situation where there may be some type of disease situation, or an external cue such as training load or illness coming into the system. So how your body copes with stress is what we generally look at in an athletic environment, is providing some type of resiliency for our athletes to be able to deal with the stress. Now, in that instance, we may be talking about training stress. So what are we doing in order to help the athlete cope with the stress that we're putting on them? Then if you look at other types of stressors, such as travel, and we know that especially today with everything post-COVID where athletes are traveling more frequently, what is the travel stresses associated, and how does the body cope with that stress? And then obviously for us, if we talk about the psychological stress that everyone seems to be under these days. So if we look at the physiological, the social and the psychological, all of these stresses coming into the system, and then how the body actually is able to cope with those particular stresses. One of the areas that we like to look at is from a hormonal perspective. What does the body show in response to these particular stresses? And probably the one that the listeners will be most familiar with would be something such as cortisol. So what is that stress hormone display under times of increased stress? And then what are the implications of prolonged stress within the organism, and how is that then manifested in what we would consider in our terms being maladaptation to a particular stress? Stress is everywhere and it's in different domains. And one of our roles is to try and assist the athlete to be able to be more resilient and tolerate changes within the stress load that they are under.
I understand. Sometimes some of our colleagues don't have access to, for example, blood tests to check the hormones of our players. And most of the time, also, we know that sometimes we are looking for some stressors, especially during the preseason. So how do you recommend to understand if that stress is too much or is too low in that particular part of the season, if you don't have access to, for example, blood tests and some other more expensive tests?
Yeah, Roberto, that's a great question. How do we look at coming up with a monitoring system to determine how the athlete is coping with the overall stress on them? And if we go, simplistically from what tools do we have every day as coaches? Now, it could be something as simple as, are we monitoring fluctuations in body weight? So what we would say is there shouldn't be a huge fluctuation day to day in our athletes' body weight. So there shouldn't be huge reductions in body weight. What are the fluctuations in our athletes' mood profile? So what is their mood like day to day? And once again, it should be fairly steady. We'll see a period of arousal when they go into comp or training, a slight dip after the competition, and then a baseline measure that comes across. So if we look at body weight and we look at mood, then if we look at other things like sleep, and we know that stress can have an impact on quality of sleep. So for sleep, for example, with your questionnaire, it may be, can you tell me how many sleep disruptions you encountered last night? So does the athlete wake up frequently during the night? And then the adjunct to that would be, what is the sleep latency? How long does the athlete perceive that it takes them to fall asleep or regain sleep after having an awakening? So we could go back and look at body weight, we could look at mood, now we can look at sleep. And the other one that we often look at within our athletes revolves around energy and food intake. What is their current level of energy? So do they have high levels of energy, moderate or low? And quite often we could have a look at that energy and just general signs and symptoms of fatigue. And usually we would see this inverse relationship where fatigue is quite high and then their energy levels are quite low. Now, there's a lot to be said for psychometric questionnaires where we can just ask our athletes these questions on a day-to-day or every other day basis to determine how are they coping with the stress that's on them. So we could look at body weight, we could look at mood, we can look at sleep, we can look at energy, all right, we can look at fatigue. So there's several there that we can have a look at to determine how the athlete is coping with the stress that they're under at the moment.
Are there other ways to assess sleep?
Yeah, look, it's really a hot topic in the world of sports science and professional sport. And funny enough, we're working with Basketball New Zealand women's female national team at the moment in the lead up to the Asia Cup in June, and we've challenged our girls at the moment. So there's about 85 days left before the competition for the Asia Cup. So if we challenged our players and said, can you do your best to try and accumulate for me 1 hour per day more sleep? So 1 hour per day more sleep between now and the competition. But that equates to about 3.5 days of full sleep. So if we can just get 1 hour extra per day over the course of the next 3 months until the competition, we've accumulated about 3.5 days worth of sleep. Now, everyone talks about sleep banking or banking sleep, and I'm not sure that the evidence shows that there is a way that we can quantify that or do that. However, what we do look at is if we know we have a stressor coming up. So we're traveling, we're flying internationally overseas, crossing multiple time zones. We then have a camp that we're going to attend, a pre-tournament camp, and then a competition. What we would like to do is try and invest in our athletes to have them just increase a little bit of sleep in the lead up to that stress event. Because usually what we know is when our athletes are at competition or post-travel, they usually are sleep deprived during those periods, whether it's they've got performance anxiety or the change of environment, change of time zone, those sort of things. So asking the athlete then to try and gain more sleep can actually be counterintuitive because it puts a stress on the athlete when they can't get the sleep that you're asking them to obtain at that point in time. So looking at what can we do to assist the athlete in the lead up to that to try and actually focus on the sleep. And just that might be, looking at what sleep hygiene strategies they're currently following and the general ones that we're familiar with: dark, cool, quiet, right? Those would be our three keys. And then look at, can they try and retire just 30 minutes earlier than what they usually do? One of the strategies we use a lot with our athletes that we find most have had really positive responses about is diarising or journaling. So when they go, as they're about to retire and go to bed, the last thing we'll have them do before they turn off the light is any thoughts that are in their mind, let's journal those or diarise those, get them out of the system cognitively onto a piece of paper, close the book, and we have those thoughts out of our system. And a lot of our athletes, especially our female athletes, we know there's differences within obviously the male and female physiology, but our work with female athletes is our female athletes tend to be much more inquisitive around the why. Why are we training a particular way? Why are we doing this? They're very inquisitive, and quite often they're reflective thinkers. So we find it quite useful for our diarising or journaling strategy to have those players jot down their thoughts of a night, close the book, and more often than not, they will comment that they've been able to fall asleep sooner and have less disruptions during the night. So there's a couple of ways we could try and look at that with helping our athletes, gain more sleep or be more focused on sleep. What I will say though, Roberto, is sleep is a skill, right? It's not something where we can just say to an athlete, hey, I want you to go to bed earlier and get more sleep, right? It's like saying to an athlete, I want you to jump on the pitch and run more yards and get more catches or more touches. Like, it's not something that's just going to instantly occur. So we need to, with all the skills that we want to train in our athletes, we need to prepare our athletes and train them around what strategies can we give them to help them with their sleep habits. So I think sleep is a big one in that regard.
Very interesting. I like the concept of accumulating sleep prior to competition, but how would you go about accumulating sleep for an athlete that plays multiple games a week? For example, my team now is involved in Eurocup and also in the Italian League. So we travel basically every 3 days. Every 3 days, yes, we change city. Every 3 days, we change bed, the room, and so on. How would you go about it?
Yeah, that's the interesting differentiation we have, Roberto. So if I'm preparing a squad for a single event, a competition, Asia Cup, World Cup, Olympic Games, I'm trying to prepare for that particular competition, as opposed to an in-season competition where my athletes are playing in multiple competitions back to back to back, heavily condensed competition schedule. So for us, we look at what can we do to try and familiarize them with the environment, right? So we would have all of our athletes, we get them to travel with something. Take your pillow, take your sensory deprivation device, your white noise signaling device, something that's familiar with them that they can take into the environment. The other thing we do is give some thought to, is a particular athlete, are they a snorer? Are they a mouth breather? All right, identifying those athletes, because if they're in a position where they've had to share a room, is one athlete keeping up another athlete? if they are a snorer or a mouth breather, can I have some type of assessment of sleep function? If we look at sleep apnea, for example, have I had some assessments around that for the particular athlete? And then the other thing we'd like to do is, we're very cognizant of the best data we can collect quite often is not us being overly scientific, but having these open one-on-one discussions with our athletes and have them tell us what do they think is best for them to assist with their sleep. In this environment, though, I would strongly encourage napping and using napping as a tool, and then the strategic ingestion of caffeine centered around napping. They're two strategies that we would look at with our athletes that have these back-to-back games, multiple games with travel in between in this congested seasonal schedule.
And how would you schedule caffeine throughout the day?
Yeah, so for us, if they're having a nap, we know the latency is around this 30-minute period with the half-life of caffeine itself. So for us, it would be a 20-minute nap thereabouts. They would ingest, their caffeine 10 minutes or so before they go for their nap. And what we generally find, napping is one of those ones where it is individual, and there's some very generic guidelines around, do I nap for 20 minutes? Do I nap for half an hour? Do I nap for an hour? What we're interested in is within the nap, upon awakening, how does the athlete feel upon awakening? Do they feel like they are in quite a dozed state, all right? Or this appearing to have a very slow wake-up period and almost be in this brain fog as they wake up. And so we would try and determine when they get to their sleep point that they don't have those type of symptoms. For most people, that would be that, around 30 minutes period of time that you see recommended. And then once again, with the caffeine ingestion, the strategic caffeine ingestion, we're around 10 minutes pre-nap. So by the time that caffeine has made it across the brain barrier, that's about the 30-minute mark. Around the same time, we're having them wake up from their nap. So they're being assisted, especially within the androgen receptors themselves as they wake up, that hopefully they don't have any of this sleep hangover or this brain fog that's occurring from waking up from their nap. But once again, if we have athletes consuming caffeine, then there's some thought to when they're having their nap and when they're having the caffeine ingestion in relation to their next sleep episode. So there are a couple of things that we need to consider, along with what is currently the habitual caffeine intake of the athlete. I have some athletes we work with that have fairly high tolerance levels to caffeine. So once again, it's not about do we have this within their normal caffeine prescription for the day, as opposed to adding more caffeine on top of what they currently consume. So just being a little bit more strategic around the dosing of the caffeine for the individual athlete.
I understand. I have a couple more questions about sleeping, because that's a very interesting topic, and I think it's one of the best recovery tools that we have at our disposal, and sometimes maybe it's overlooked, but it's very, very interesting. So one of the questions is, what would you recommend to those athletes that have families that live far away? For example, I have a lot of American players here that have to stay awake till late to just talk with their families. And most of the time they probably go to sleep at 3 or 4 a.m. And then the morning after they have practice at 10 a.m.
So the example I'd give you for that was probably some of the initial work that I believe is responsible for this drive in sleep research. And that is with Dr. Sherry Ma, who looked at, and you're probably familiar with her research, where she looked at sleep extension, right? So having Stanford basketball players accumulate around 10 hours of sleep within the 24-hour time period, right? So if I know that I have an athlete that is going to have sleep disruption because they might get a small dose of sleep, and then they're going to wake up to try and talk to their family at a particular time in a different country, and then go back to sleep, it would be looking at how can we schedule within the 24-hour period that they can accumulate, that general recommended 8 to 10 hours of sleep within that 24-hour period. So that's one way we could certainly look at trying to ensure that within that 24-hour period, they're accumulating, that 8 to 10 hours of sleep. Sleep disruptions, once again, are looking at what can we do for the athlete. And I know that their level of cognition and alertness will be increased if they're engaging in talking and FaceTime and being on a video call with their family. But then look at after they've finished that call, if they're going to retire, what steps can they put into place to try and turn down the tone and actually turn off some of the alertness centers within their brain to allow them to sleep. So once again, is that like a quick lukewarm shower? Is it them, while they're talking with their better half and on the phone, looking at still being in a fairly quiet and dark space? Now we know that the difference between alertness and consciousness comes into play. So I can be conscious and still do a task. And the simple task I'll say is I wake up in the middle of the night and I need to go to the bathroom. So I can complete that task without being alert. I can get myself to the bathroom. I can go to the bathroom. I can make my way back to bed. But if I wake up and then I turn the light on, so all of a sudden I'm starting to turn on the alert centers of my brain. And then I look over and I look at the clock to see what time it is. And then I get up and I go to the bathroom. I turn the light on there. Then I turn the light off. I come back out. And once again, I then have another look at the clock. And then I started doing the silly thing of doing backward math in order to go, if I fall asleep now, I'm going to get 4 hours more sleep or 5 hours. So all of a sudden now I've turned on all these alert centers in my brain. And when I try to go back to sleep, post-sleep interruption, my latency becomes quite extended. So in that instance, it would be try to minimize the amount of alerting factors that come into the situation and into the play. So with that, the 24-hour cycle, can we try and accumulate 8 to 10 hours of sleep in that cycle for the player? And then with they're trying to retire after the awakening and having the interaction, what can we do to try and turn down the tone for the alertness centers within the brain?
I understand. Is there also something that we can do from a nutritional standpoint?
Yeah, look, nutrition is one of those interesting ones, right? With what can I do to try and help? And nutritionally, probably the most spoken about nutrient or amino acid in that regard is tryptophan. So tryptophan is one of the amino acids that has been linked to serotonin release in particular. So, and this is why you quite often hear about, tryptophan being in higher qualities in things such as milk, such as meat. So when people have their turkey and then I get a bit sleepy after eating my Christmas turkey, I need to have a nap. So some strategic ingestion of tryptophan may be of value in relation to that. But probably on the other side of thing as a supplemental sleep aid, such as tryptophan, but the other part would be the usual things we would suggest to try and avoid. So that being your high sugar, high fat consumptions. And quite often, and we've had this experience before too, when they jump online and they're talking away and then they're just snacking on, those types of comfort type foods, the higher sugar, the higher fat options. So maybe, if they're going to do something, the nice cup of warm milk, and they can be drinking that while they're talking to their family and friends, and they're not going to have the issues around, the insulin spike and the issues with blood glucose from these high sugar foods for sure. So supplementing, potentially tryptophan may have some part to play. We actually used some supplementation with the Perth Wildcats in the National Basketball League a few years ago, and we had some success with the players anecdotally that reported less sleep disruption and an improvement in sleep latency. So when they had an awakening, so they had less awakenings within the night, and then when they did have an awakening and they had to regain sleep, they actually had shorter latency periods to fall back to sleep. So we have had some play, and there's a significant amount of evidence out there looking at the efficacy of tryptophan if our listeners want to look up some of that stuff.
Got it. Stephen, I would like to talk with you about recovery in general. Of course, we talked a lot about sleeping, but now I would like to know what are the best tools that we can use with our athletes for recovery. Of course, we already touched on sleep. We talked a little bit about nutrition. And what are the other easy tools that we can use with our athletes?
Yeah, I think the angle I take with this, Roberto, is everyone talks about recovery, and have we got to the point where, some sectors go, hey, we're over recovering. We're not allowing the body to adapt to the stress and these types of things. But I think it's, how can we promote the athlete to be able to tolerate the workloads that we're giving them? And recovery is a key factor that. Now, she's going back a few years now. 2011, we published, the implementation of recovery strategies with our 100-point recovery checklist, and that's morphed into multiple versions of our recovery checklist now. But ultimately, how can you engage the athlete into the process more so than the strategy itself? And we often get asked for advice on what's the best recovery strategy to have the athlete do. And my answer is pretty simple, Roberto. It's whatever recovery strategy you can get the athlete to do, right? Like it's not so much, hey, these are all the ones we need to do. Yes, for sure. Our listeners need to look for the efficacy of the recovery strategy. Like, does it actually promote recovery in the areas that you're looking at? And for myself and my staff, there's really 4, right? We want to look at substrate recovery, right? So energetic. We want to look at psychological recovery. We want to look at muscular, and then we want to look at neural. So for us, there's really 4 recovery domains, we call them, that we try and look at. Then we provide a multitude of recovery strategies that fall within these domains. And then one thing I'd be really interested in your view on this is, I think our athletes like some autonomy. They like the choice, right? So within the recovery domain of muscular, here's 4 or 5 recovery strategies. You choose the one that what do you like to do? Which one do you do regularly? And so we provide some autonomy for the players to choose their recovery strategy. Now, once again, each of those recovery strategies within each domain, we would put a points weighting system to each of those recovery strategies. And then within the 24-hour post-game period, we challenge the players to bank X number of recovery points. Now, two of those 4 recovery domains, we strongly recommend players use 2 of those. The psychological and the substrate, we strongly encourage our players to look for recovery modalities within there. And then your autonomy is, you can choose recovery strategies then from the muscular or the neurological. You choose. But the psychological and the substrate, they're our go-tos in that 24-hour post-game period. And then we allow some autonomy for the players to choose other recovery modalities from the other 2 domains, being muscular and being neurological. So I think all athletes want to engage in recovery practices, but sometimes they're just not sure what to do. So using your recovery point system, having your athletes with a recovery options in different domains, having them challenge them to bank X number of points. And I don't know, all of the athletes that we deal with, they have one inherent unique trait, and that is competition. They love to compete. So when we add some type of competition to the strategy that we're trying to employ, 9 times out of 10, we get, really good compliance within the group, because they like to see their name at the top of the leaderboard, man. Doesn't matter what it is, but they like to see, hey, who's got the most recovery points? What have they been doing? And then we have those little internal challenges and those competitions within the group. So look, I don't know if that answered your question specifically about what's the best recovery strategy, because I would say the best one would be whichever strategy you can get the athlete to do, but then look at some options based on the different recovery domains specifically. For us, substrate and psychological are our go-to, and then we look at muscular and neurological with some autonomy for the athlete to choose from.
I like it. I like this strategy. Stephen, I think that, I really like what you just said, but especially in my experience, I feel that if we give too much autonomy to our athletes, they tend to focus on one single tool. And if they use one single tool for, let's say, 10 months, this tool loses its effectiveness, especially in the part of the season where that counts the most. For example, if we use, I'm just saying randomly, like we use the foam roller every single day, 365 days of the year, when it counts the most, that simple tool doesn't have effectiveness anymore.
Yeah, for sure. And look, I hope my athletes don't take offense to this, because I liken my athletes to little children, right? Like to kids. So if we set kids into a room and we put 100 balls there for them to play with, day one, they'd be jumping on and loving and throwing every ball. But over the course of the year, they'd get sick of doing that. So once again, I think the skills as the strength and conditioning coach or the sports scientist or the performance staff, I think one of the skills we need to develop is, okay, we're not going to provide them every single recovery option within that domain. And we know that at different times of the season, we might have to focus on specific recovery strategies. So we can be strategic with aligning different recovery strategies within that domain at different times within the year. So I take your point on board 100%. If we did the same recovery modality every single day, it would not be effective when we need it to be most effective. So let's have a look at, can I utilize a smaller portion of recovery strategies to engage the athlete? Because I think that's the key thing we need to do here, Roberto. We need to engage the athlete in the proactive approach to recovery. So let's not give them all of the toys. Let's just give them a few, and then we can use those other recovery strategies at specific times when we think they're going to be most beneficial. But you raise a really good point.
Yeah. And Stephen, can you give us some examples as far as a psychological recovery?
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's a few of these at the moment. I've been having a lot of discussions lately with colleagues from around the globe, and especially shout out to Dr. Meta Singh with their sleep work. We're involved in a collaboration with Meta, Professor Julio Gonzalez, Thomas Heyer. When we look at some of the people we collaborate with specifically, we're having lots of discussions around these. Jonathan Charhurst in Canada. And one of the things we've been trying to look at the moment is providing our athletes more margin to breathe. Now, what I mean by that is not just improving their breath, right? But we feel like quite often athletes feel like they're being smothered and constricted because it's being a professional athlete, and especially as you know, it's a day-to-day grind doing what you do. I have a colleague of mine who's working in the NHL at the moment. As the same with the NBA, 82-game season, multiple games a week, 170-day season with 82 games stuck in there, then playoffs at the back end of that, lots of travel. So our margin to breathe becomes very narrow because we're constantly on the go with all of these external pressures. So looking at ways we can promote within our athletes an increase in their margin to breathe. A couple of ways we can do that. We like to use creative visualization and positive suggestion. We've used that successfully with a lot of our athletes across the time. We like to use anchoring techniques to bring the athlete back to the here and now. And quite often you would hear Coach K talk about the play present mindset. So for us, it's about anchoring to bring the athletes back. Anchoring is a really interesting one too, because it comes from a field that I don't think most of our coaches or listeners will be familiar with. It actually comes from aviation. And some of the initial research in anchoring looked at when they were training pilots and looking at pilots, they had all this pilot data from pilots who had survived a catastrophic event, i.e. plane crashing. And then when they surveyed all of these pilots, they said to them, what was it that they were able to do at that point when the pressure was the most highest? They realized they're now entering a catastrophic event. They looked and turned to the operations manual. They don't pick it up. They just look at it and they do this gazing at the operation manual to anchor themselves to here and now. Because you could only imagine how many times would have a pilot read through the operations manual page to page, back to back. How many free throws have our players taken? The one shot, which is uncontested, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds, thousands upon thousands. So anchoring to the here and now. So our anchoring techniques, and we've used this in the National Basketball League with players, and we've had some really good success with players improving substantially their free throw percentage. And that was the anchoring technique would be going to the free throw line, closing their eyes, 2 deep breaths, centering themselves by tapping their toes, opening their eyes, fixated gaze at some point on the backboard, And that whole process is only taken like 3-4 seconds. And then the player would go through whatever their normal free throw shooting routine is. But we've anchored them to the moment here and now. So we use anchoring quite a lot. We think that it shows a lot of promise to not allow our players and athletes to get, too far down the track or too hooked up on what's happened already. Try and stay to the here and now. So there's two that we use. Other psychological approaches, and this one is interesting because this one really intrigued me, working a lot with pre-elite youth athletes. And this psychological technique is as simple as goal setting itself. When was the last time you sat down with all your players and had them write out individually their goals for this next period, the goals for the season, the goals for the next 5 years, actually writing them down? And there's some really interesting data that looks at less than 3% of the adult population actually physically write out their goals, right? That's mind-blowing to me with such an easy strategy, because the thing is, when the writing goes onto the paper, now it's real, right? I've actually written it down. This is what I said I'm going to do. So now I've got this obligation to my ethical self that this is what I'm going to set my mind on what to do. And then it's not only about writing out your goals, it's then about the second step, which is putting some actionable steps in place to take you and lead you to achieving those goals. All right, my goal is to increase my free throw shooting percentage. All right, what's the actionable step I need to take? All right, I'm going to put up and do 200 makes a day. Not shots, 200 makes. Right, now I've got an actionable step linked to my goal. Okay, but the third step is now sharing that with somebody else. So now I'm going to be accountable because I've already told my peer, my other point guard, hey, man, this is what I'm going to do every day. And then the fourth point is now I'm going to check back in with that person that I've confided into at a regular point to tell them how I'm going with my goal achievement. So writing down goals is the first step, but then there's a series of actionable steps that we can go through that anchor us to ensuring that we go through each one of those steps. And, the late, great Kobe Bryant spoke about his obsessive desire to improve. And that's linked to writing down your goals, putting in a series of steps to get better. And there's a really good clip of Kobe talking about, okay, I come in the league and I'm known for shooting air balls. Okay, what's the problem with that? I just don't have the legs. In high school, man, I had a 35-game season. Now I'm an 82-game. I just don't have the legs in the back end of the season. Right. What have I got to do? I've got to get stronger. So now I need to tailor my strength program to keep some pop in my legs across 82 games. So then he went and worked on that. So I think there's a couple around that, the creative visualization and positive suggestion, taking us somewhere else and then bringing us back to the present. The anchoring is one we use quite a lot, and something as simple as just goal setting. And it's funny you mentioned the psychological traits. In our book that I wrote with basketball coach Rob Beveridge, the book's called When Winning Matters, Lessons Learned from Sport Elite. We published this last year. And in our section on, we have a chapter in the book called The One Percenters. And when we went and surveyed all of the athletes and said, what do you think are the most important things that are impactful in you as an athlete? There ended up being 7 that we did a thematic reduction and we came up with 7. And the top 5 were all psychological strategies. So athletes recognize the importance of psychological strategies in allowing them to perform at their best. What is it about their future self that they want to bring out right now? And psychological strategies appear to be, well, I said in the top 7 that we were able to compile with our thematic reduction, the top 5 of those were all psychological. So it's an ever developing field, and looking at ways to help athletes deal with pressure, to help athletes understand where they are in the moment, and to help athletes let go of the moment once it's passed. So I think there's a lot of work we can do in that space.
Very interesting. And Stephen, which are some strategies that you would use with coaches as far as trying to have them more present in the moment, and also as far as trying to manage the stress that it comes with the job itself?
Yeah, look, that is a really good question. And, for us, we've been able to do some work recently with some of our collaborations. And one of the publications that we were able to publish a couple of years ago now, geez, time gets away, 2023. This was 2021. And we published a paper called The Recovery Umbrella in the World of Elite Sport. Do not forget the coaching and performance staff. That was published in a journal called Sports with Julio and Cangelo Gonzalez, myself, Thomas, and a number of contributors to this particular paper. And what we were trying to do was have a look at, there's all this talk about recovery for athletes, but there's nothing that's really suggested in targeting coaches. So we went through and were able to conduct a matrix of what would coaches actually benefit from in relation to their specific tasks. So if you look at the task domain, so for example, if I'm a performance coach, and that's the domain, and that might be the head coach, the assistant coach, the head of player development, those sort of coaches. What's their primary role? So we defined that. Are they involved in game day travel? We looked at that. Then we tried to identify what were the potential fatigue factors that would be implemented with that particular domain of the performance coach. So now you're talking about travel, psychological, emotional fatigue. If we look at acypenia, so eye strain, we look at postural fatigue, being in front of the computer all day. Right. So now in my matrix, I've identified 3 or 4 potential fatigue risk factors. So what can we do then? Are any of those factors then aligned to health risk factors? So sleep disorders, emotional exhaustion, social isolation. All right, what recovery areas would help the particular coach? And some for these might be focusing on immune health and immune function, postural resetting, looking at sleep hygiene, looking at mindfulness strategies. So if you look at something such as a performance coach, i.e. a head coach, there are several potential fatigue and health risks associated with that profession. But nobody really delves into, okay, what are some of the recovery focus areas that would help that particular coach? And then you go down the list from even the medical and therapy, staff in that regard. So, massage therapists, athletic trainers, what with them? You're looking at travel. We're looking at cognitive fatigue. We're looking at physical fatigue. Once again, does that lead to psychological exhaustion or sleep disorders? Because, and I'm only recently been privileged to have discussions with some colleagues working in the NHL. And you think about even the equipment managers for an NHL team, like they're the last in, the first in, the last out. Team's been and gone. They're packing up. They're moving all of the gear for the whole squad. They have the craziest schedule. So what is it for them around sleep hygiene and immune function and mindfulness to keep them prepped, ready to go for the whole duration of 82 games, obviously 41 on the road and 41 at home. But really considering that in relation to how can I identify these potential fatigue areas, link them to any health risk, and then try and identify a recovery focus area to help my coaches stay healthy in the game. And it wasn't that long ago, there was some substantial social media around some NBA coaches that had to take absences of time from the NBA because of the stress and pressure and the health risk that they were under. So don't forget the coaches at all. They need to be doing recovery, albeit maybe slightly different to athletes, but they need to focus on that. And listeners can find that particular paper in Sports through MDPI. Good read for everyone to have a look at.
Yeah, very interesting paper. Absolutely. Stefan, we've come to the end of this episode. And if some of our listeners would like to reach out to you, where they can find you?
Certainly. Thanks for that. Look, LinkedIn is the easiest one. So Stephen Bird _PhD. If you just look me up, Stephen.pbird, and they'll find me on socials. But I'm most active on LinkedIn, and obviously do some socials through Twitter as well. But happy to catch up with the listeners and discuss any of these areas in more detail. And just want to thank you for your time. It's always a challenge to catch up and meet and have these discussions. But I think the sharing of knowledge to our profession is what makes our profession, what it is today. So thank you, my friend, for the opportunity to have a chat.
Thank you very much for taking the time and spending some time with us today.
Wow, another great episode with another great guest. I really enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Stephen Bird, and if you guys liked it, please subscribe to the channel and share it on your social media. And don't forget that you can find Sport Vitamins on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, guys, I'm out.